Welcome to this edition of American Purpose. My name is Jack Moline, and I am president of Interfaith Alliance. 60 years ago, Henry Luce, publisher of Life magazine, invited 10 prominent men, each to compose an essay on the national purpose. Then as now, there was a sense that we stood at the beginning of a time of cultural and political change. Our project expands on this work as each episode explores one perspective on where our nation was, where it is, and where it should be heading with a contemporary thought leader. My guests are from the worlds of faith, government, politics, and culture, and they have generously agreed to share this time with us. You can find out more about Interfaith Alliance and our mission to protect your faith and freedom at interfaithalliance.org and by listening to our radio program and podcast, State of Belief, at stateofbelief.com. But right now, let's find out more about the American purpose with my guest, Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Welcome, Senator.
Great to be with you, Jack.
We're going to just dive right in and ask you the same question I opened for everyone with, which is, in your opinion, what was the original national purpose of the United States?
Well, that's a great question, and I'll try and answer it concisely, which is a challenge for a senator. There's a real tension between the founding documents that created the United States, so the Constitution, and why people came to the United States from other places in the world and what the impact was on those who were already here. So our founding documents, from the preamble to the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, lay out a remarkable vision, a powerful and an inspiring purpose for the United States. A place where we had hoped to gradually perfect ourselves to form a more perfect union, a place that was founded on freedom from tyranny. If you look just at the First Amendment, it's got all those fundamental freedoms. And I'll remind you, in the very first sentence, freedom from the establishment of religion, freedom to exercise one's faith as one chooses, freedom of speech, of press, of petition, of assembly. So the founding purpose in some ways in our documents was soaring and aspirational, and that reflected the fact that what motivated thousands and thousands of settlers to first come here, mostly from Europe at that point, was as a place of refuge and a place of opportunity. For many of the early settlers who came to these shores, they were either fleeing religious-based violence and oppression in Europe or seeking to make their fortune, seeking free land and open spaces. But we can't forget or overlook that there were also those who were enslaved or indentured at the very beginning of our nation. We are so tightly interwoven with the institution of slavery that it's even recognized in the Constitution as something that led to fundamental and structural challenges. I call it America's founding sin. And the original purpose of the United States in terms of our relationship with the indigenous peoples, with the Native Americans, is also equally morally fraught. So what's on paper in the Constitution and the vision of the founders and framers, soaring and inspirational, the challenges in terms of the human suffering that was imposed on Native Americans and on enslaved Africans and others who were indentured cannot be overlooked as part of that tension at the very founding of our nation.
I can't help but think that it is refreshing and honest to hear a voice like this in the United States Senate, because you know from the history of the Senate, those perspectives weren't always well represented among your colleagues back in the day.
Correct.
So given what you've just said, what do you believe is or ought to be the American purpose going forward?
So to do our absolute best at earning the best parts of our legacy and confronting and moving past the worst parts of our inheritance or our legacy as a nation. One of the blessings of being a senator is I've had the chance as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee to travel all over the world, to meet with common people and with national leaders in countries on several continents. And one of the things most Americans, I think, don't realize is just how loudly our example preaches to the world about what democracy is and should be, the ways in which whatever our national leaders say and do is front page news in dozens of countries around the world. So if you think about just this last year, Jack, a pandemic where the United States, notionally one of the most sophisticated and advanced countries on earth, demonstrably failed in keeping its own people safe. Our national response to the pandemic under the last president was a tragic failure. And we are delivering to the world some of the most promising vaccines that are going to get us out of this. On January 6th, we saw a riot at the Capitol of the United States that was a more shattering event around the legitimacy of our electoral processes than anything that's happened in my lifetime. And last summer, in a series of protests where tens of millions of Americans came out and peacefully marched in cities and towns all over our country, we saw a renewed focus on the racial injustice and inequality that has long been at the very core of our society and its tensions. So, what is it that is our purpose going forward? It's to continue to be a country that deserves the effort and intention and affection of millions of people seeking to come here from around the world, again, for refuge, for opportunity, and for a place where they can be the individuals they're meant to be in a context of a community that is supportive and welcoming. What we also have to make our purpose, and this was central to the election of our now president and vice president, was seeing the hard parts of our history and doing something about it, addressing the inequalities in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of who had to keep going to work during a pandemic and who could safely sequester at home, looking at the ways in which inequality is baked into the very basis of our system and society and tackling it and making progress addressing it. That would mean making good on the promise of America.
So let's get down to specifics just a little bit. Our society rests on certain foundational values. Some of them are very admirable and others of them not so. You've named them a little bit. What one or two values are worth doubling down on for us as America?
Hope is the most simple one, but in some ways the most powerful one. There's people all over the world who live in societies where they think they have no role, they have no power, they have no opportunity, they have no hope. And part of what America represents to them, part of what America in its best form represents to Americans who are living in circumstances far below what they dream of, is hope. So frankly, if there's one thing that I think most inspires me about public service in the United States and most encourages me, is the ways in which I have met people over and over who believed in the promise of America, believed in opportunity, inclusion, and in fairness, even when the American system hadn't demonstrated any reason that those people would believe that. Congressman John Lewis, a friend to both of us, someone who has inspired me my whole life, is one of those best examples. When you sit and talk with Congressman Lewis about his childhood, what about the circumstances of his childhood would lead him to believe that he could play some central role in a march towards racial equality? He grew up in some of the most brutal, segregated circumstances in American history, and yet believed in the promise of America, even when its reality, as lived by him and his extended family as a boy, showed no reason for him to have optimism about its purpose. His righteous indignation, his determination to make our nation better, and then his success, in no small part, at bringing those dreams into reality, is exactly the sort of thing we should be doubling down on, and exactly the sort of initiative we need to welcome and take in the year ahead.
So obviously there are some values that we don't want to double down on. They're holding us back from some necessary progress. Can you name a couple of those?
Nativism, isolationism, nationalism in the sense of a narrow nationalism that is a loyalty to a place, not to an idea. The United States is one of the few nations in human history that's really founded on an idea. We are not bound together by the fact that we all look the same or pray the same or speak the same or that we were all born in one place. And most nations in human history, what holds them together is the narrow nationalism of identity. The United States is made up of people who come from literally every country on earth. And yet you can be an American and fully participate in the best of what America is, whether you've been here 3 generations, 30 generations, or 3 years. We have a new member of the cabinet who's just being sworn in, Deb Haaland, who calls herself a 30th generation American. We have others who are a first generation American in the cabinet now. And I think that's the kind of inspiring example of how you can participate fully in what it means to be an American, and participate fully in the governance and the leadership and the opportunity that our society represents, regardless of whether you've always been here or just got here. So some of the values I hope to really be a part of pushing back on is a narrow nationalism and a nativism, and an isolationism that says we don't care about the rest of the world and we simply want to build walls and barriers to protect us from the rest of the world. I think that's exactly wrong, given the important elements of the best of the history of the United States.
Very nice. Very nice. You know, most of our constitutional guarantees emphasize our commonality, but you've already mentioned the First Amendment and the very beginning of the First Amendment, which is very personal. Religion, freedom of conscience. Famously, you have theological training in addition to your legal training and the other skills that you bring to your office. What are some of the values rooted in your personal belief system that you commend to those who don't necessarily share your particular beliefs?
Interesting question. I'll try and give you an answer that's relevant. Service. You know, bluntly, the environment in which I first experienced service to others was through my parents' engagement with our congregation. I was raised Presbyterian, and it was because of their experience in our church that both of my parents were challenged to get outside their comfort zone. My mom volunteered with a refugee family from South Vietnam that came here, helping them set up an apartment, helping them get integrated into American society, helping them learn English and find job opportunities. My mom also volunteered at a homeless shelter here in Wilmington, a Manual Dining Room, as did so many other families that were part of my congregation. My father, for a period when I was very young, was doing prison ministry, was visiting a convicted murderer who was in our state prison and actually brought him home on furlough weekends on occasion. But those are service opportunities that are not unique to any particular religion or faith. You can simply believe in the importance of being kind and open-hearted, welcoming others, and seeing the ways in which we shouldn't, as Brian Stevenson says, judge those who are incarcerated based on the single worst thing they ever did, but to see them as people on a trajectory where there is still some hope and some possibility of their regaining their freedom and rejoining our society. And with those who come here as refugees from violence and despotism and other places in the world, or those who are living on the streets, who are homeless, who, as we say, there but for the grace of God go I, you can reach out and extend a hand and say, here with the grace of God we go together. I think these are initiatives or efforts that they engaged in that are service that's really independent of the religious or sectional or sectarian, context in which it was done. One of the things I'm most passionate about is providing better opportunities for Americans of all ages to engage in service. For my father, it was his military service that unexpectedly gave him the chance to experience being an American. He was drafted. It was after the Second World War. He served in Germany in the 1st Infantry as a sergeant in the Signal Corps. But an unexpected benefit of his service was he got to know a whole unit. At that point, it was all men, of men who were Catholic and Protestant, Jewish and atheist, who were Northern and Southern, who were Black and white and Latino. He had no exposure in his very narrow context in which he grew up of the whole reach and breadth of our nation. My brother, when he served in the 2nd Armored, had the same experience. And so in Congress, I've been fighting for civilian domestic national service opportunities that can allow young people of all ages, whether they're helping our environment or helping with hunger, whether they're engaged in housing or in education, to have that same experience of being part of a group of people that's not rooted in any particular religion. But frankly, every religion that I know of has a calling towards trying to heal the world, to make our society better, and to show grace to others, even as we have received grace ourselves.
When we learn those values from our communities of origin and bring them to the marketplace of ideas in which we all circulate, I think sometimes we discover the commonality of something that we thought was very specific or very local. So thanks for that. How should our society pursue our national purpose, Senator?
with gentleness, with kindness, with an open-heartedness, and with a fierceness, with a determination. We are absolutely at a pivot point. I have been struck in talking with friends and colleagues around the world in recent months, just how profoundly that riot at the Capitol impacted their view of who we are, and just how profoundly some of the disputes and debates and some of the marches and protests of the last year have struck people around the world. I was in a hearing just this week in the Senate where we heard from human rights activists, from pro-democracy activists, from Burma, from Hong Kong, from South Sudan, who cited the fact that they see what's happening in the United States as encouragement, that they should have the confidence to fight for democracy as well, and as concern. That if this nation that has this capital that is sort of a visual symbol of the beacon of a place where a nation gathers and deliberates and debates and governs themselves, if that can be at risk, then is democracy itself at risk globally. One of the things I never forget as I go into that, sort of gleaming white marble building of the Capitol is that it was built in part by slaves. At the very foundation of our nation and at the very literally foundation stones of our most appealing building that is seen globally as the secular temple of democracy is that tension, is that historic inequity, that founding sin. And if we don't trust ourselves with the challenge of actually seeing it and speaking to it and addressing it, then I don't think we'll make the progress we need to. So there's a lot of folks who are uncomfortable with unearthing historic wrongs, with speaking about the ways in which Native Americans and people who came here to flee religious oppression in other places in the world and people who were brought here in chains. There's a lot of folks who don't want to have that conversation. But I would argue it's only by having that conversation and taking action to address it that we will unlock the very best aspects of the American spirit, and that we will deserve the hope that so many have in us here in our nation and around the world.
I love that you understood me to be asking initially when I said, how do we pursue the national purpose, to be asking about character traits. I think that's wonderful. I will tell you, you're unique among the people that I asked that question to, but I'm glad you got around to what do we need to be doing to pursue our national purpose as a collective. But now I want to ask you the same question about individuals. What should the individual be doing in their role of pursuing our national purpose?
Well, part of this is listening to each other, being respectful enough to give the gift of attention to each other. I'm struck at how often when I talk to other senators, when I talk to people who serve in the Senate or on my staff or people I just meet casually, these last few years, there is this sense of a deep division. People have told me they've lost lifelong friends. That in the fights over the 2020 election, the disputes of 2020, the protests, the issues, that they've literally severed ties with their extended family or with childhood friends. I personally am wrestling with the fact that a lifelong friend, someone who I grew up with, one of my best friends in high school, someone who I used to live with here in Wilmington, Delaware, was so angry at me over my view of the election and its outcome that we're not speaking anymore. And I intend to reach out to him and to say, look, can't we find some way back towards each other? The Senate and the House are supposed to be representative of the United States. And in the fact that the Senate and the House are having trouble compromising and legislating and moving, we are representing the United States. So in every family in our country, whether it's at the high holy days or at Thanksgiving, whether it's at the 4th of July or at a tailgate of a football game, as we all emerge from this pandemic, what should individuals do? I think they should risk hearing people who have profoundly different views. We all have that relative, that cousin, that uncle who, frankly, oh my gosh, do I have to spend time with her, with him? And one of the challenges we have is to risk including each other in the circle of intentionality. I remain close to a priest who I lived with and worked with in 1987. in South Africa. He lives in Soweto now. He's a white priest, originally from the suburbs, but who took up the cause of anti-apartheid activism. And he was intimately engaged with the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa. And I know he would say that they are far from done with addressing the legacy of apartheid. But one of the things he has said to me on a number of occasions is, if you don't surface and speak to and address the issues that drove a lot of this profound tension and conflict in your nation in the last year, it'll never heal. You can't simply, paper it over and pretend that didn't happen and move on. And that means for those of us who are really happy about the outcome of the last election and really excited about our current majorities in the House and Senate, we have to be willing to listen to those who are really unhappy and who really think that they're being marginalized, just as I had expected or hoped that they would be listening to me in the last 4 years when there was a political dispensation or configuration that I disagreed with. The very foundation of a functional democracy is the belief that you are more likely to achieve your goals and your hopes through compromise and consensus than you are through violence. And there is a significant portion of this country, on the right and left, that thinks that violence is justified in order to achieve their political goals. And that hasn't been part of my political reality or my sense of our nation in my lifetime. And I think we need to be attentive to that, and being willing to take the risk of hearing each other and respecting each other and expressing a common purpose for our nation is an important building block of our having a future as a nation.
So you've given me the perfect setup for my last question, which is this. Are you optimistic about America's future?
Part of why I was so excited about our current president, about Joe, is that he has an absolute, in his bones, deep optimism about our nation. And I couldn't imagine someone doing a better job than he would of reminding us of those signature moments, those central conflicts in our history. I'm a big history buff. My parents, my grandparents did a lot of talking to me about our nation's history. I have ancestors who served as a Minuteman in the Revolutionary War, as a colonel in the Civil War. As my father, who passed away a number of years ago, my father and I spent a lot of time together soon after President Trump was inaugurated. He was in his last few weeks of life at that point. And he challenged me to go to Antietam. And he said to me, if you think this moment that you're living through is hard, if you think that the struggle of fighting for democracy with this president is difficult, I'd like you to go stand on the ridgeline that your ancestor defended and recognize that more Americans died in combat on that field on that day than any other day in our history, and realize that this is a fight worth fighting for. And it's more important that we not fight, that we find a way to avoid a second American Civil War, that we find a way to respect each other and hear each other and trust each other. And that's hard. And so I'm still working through that assignment. I did go to Antietam. I did find the spot where my ancestors stood.
Wow.
And what is today a beautiful rolling farm field with historical markers was on that one day a place of incredible terror and loss and bloodshed. And as we look at the future, the thing that gives me the most optimism is what we've overcome. The Depression, the Second World War, the division of Vietnam, of the Civil Rights Movement, the protests that we've seen this last year, the ways in which people came out and voted and showed hope and confidence, the moments I've seen of dramatic service and sacrifice in this pandemic, the millions of essential workers who've just gotten up and gone and done the right thing, and the ways in which people have volunteered and given of themselves to help neighbors and friends and family and complete strangers in the midst of the suffering of a pandemic that's taken more than 500,000 Americans from us. I am optimistic about our future because I know how much we've overcome. It also gives me pause because I know how hard this journey has been in some of the chapters in the past. So I have no choice but to be an optimist. That's what propels me into service every day. And I'll close with this one thought. A good friend of mine serves in the Senate alongside me. His name's Michael Bennett. He's from Colorado. And Michael ran for president. And he wasn't successful. He was on the stage.
I heard that.
But, he spent a year. And the first time that Michael was back in the Senate, he came and found me. And I said, how do you feel about America? And he said, I am more optimistic about our country now than I've ever been. He said, I traveled all over the country. I did, coffee shops and town halls. And before the pandemic set in, he was in states all over the country. And he said, I am more confident that the American people actually know what we're about and know why we're here and know what we're for than we do here in the Senate. And he said, I don't have great optimism about the Senate or the senators, but I have huge optimism about the people and the future and our purpose. So I'll share that with you as my closing remark, that I have great optimism about the future of our nation and our purpose.
Well, I'm happy to tell you that I'm a little more optimistic about the Senate having you in it, even though I know that there have been there's been talk and attempts to get you into one of the other branches of government. I'm glad you are where you are right now.
Thank you.
Thanks to you, our listeners, for engaging with us exploring the American purpose. It has been an honor and a pleasure to spend this time with Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, who shared his perspective so generously. You can listen to this and other episodes at americanpurpose.org and learn more about our work at stateofbelief.com and interfaithalliance.org. Interfaith Alliance has produced this program under the guidance of Ray Kirstein. I am Jack Moline, encouraging you to live with purpose.